3 speakers during this webinar. This is Zenebe Uraguchi from HELVETAS Swiss Intercooperation, Gavin Anderson, and John Burns. Gavin is an independent consultant, has done a lot of work with the Springfield Center, where John Burns is from. Most of you will know the institution. It's the home of the M4P approach. We are going to have a webinar. We are going to try to keep the initial presentation to about 30 minutes. So I'll soon hand over after a short intro to Zenebe. Then we'll have 30 minutes of presentations, 30 minutes or a bit more for questions and answers. We have extended a bit the time for this webinar to be about 1.5 hours, so that there's enough time for people to ask questions. The recording of this will be available on the Beam website and will also be emailed to all the participants after the webinar. And all the research that's going to be referenced during the webinar will be available on the website too. So thank you all for joining. What I'm going to do is give a very quick intro into the global challenges of youth employment as viewed from the ILO. The numbers that you see on the next slide, maybe I should say I'm from the lab, which is a project at the ILO that looks at how to use market systems development for decent work. So basically what we look at is a range of different aspects of jobs and job quality. So we're really keen to hear a bit on this innovative approach on addressing youth employment. But let me give you a short background on what the global challenges on youth employment are. These numbers come out of the World Economic and Social Outlook, which is an ILO publication that looks at youth employment in between other things. And what you see here is 3 numbers that give you a bit an overview of the scale of the problem. 40% of the world's active youth are either unemployed or working poor. So the unemployment records in many countries don't show how many people are actually doing some sort of activity but are not able to get above the poverty line out of that activity. This number is much higher for young people than for the overall population. About 73 million young people are currently registered as looking for a job on the globe. And a large proportion of the world's unemployed are actually in the ages of 15 to 24. So clearly, the challenge of unemployment is bigger for youth than for other population groups. This has to do with many limitations in terms of having no work experience, but also missing access to capital, often no ownership of resources obviously also limits your access to other types of capital. For young entrepreneurs, for example, but the whole the transition from school to work and your capacities to get into the labor markets obviously also plays a big role. I'm very interested in this webinar because we've been looking, and many of the M4P projects globally work with agricultural value chains, which in what we have found so far are very often not the places where you need to look for new jobs for young people. That has to do with the fact that if you want to increase incomes in agriculture, it's really around making agriculture more productive, and youth on top of that also want to get out of these sectors. So it's going to be very, very difficult to create new jobs in agriculture, which is what many M4P projects actually are trying to do. Which is why I think what we're going to hear now is so interesting, because it's really trying to look at the labor market for youth and trying to figure out in a systemic way how do we address those issues. With that, I'm now going to hand over to Zenebe, and further on to Gavin and John, who have been working on a case study about the program. Zenebe?
Thanks very much, Merten. My introductory remark is intended to highlight 2 key messages coming from the 2 case studies which Gavin and John will be presenting today. Gavin did the case study of RISI Albania on media, and John did the case study of iKosovo on job matching services. To begin with, we all know about the seriousness of global unemployment. Merten also touched this, in particular for young women and men. Yet the most important question for me we should ask ourselves is, why are solutions proposed not working, or the impacts are very much limited? One reason, which is the main takeaway from today's webinar, is the lack of proper focus on holistic, or what I call integrated dimensions of labor market systems. What does this mean in practice? A labor market system is composed of, as you can see in the next slide, it's composed of different dimensions. You have skills development, that's the supply side. You have in the middle, intermediation, focusing, for example, on labor market information and matching services. And then the third one is on demand. That's private sector development or investment for creating jobs. Around these three dimensions also come labor market policies, focusing, for example, on job quality to tackle problems such as inadequate earnings and unproductive work, such as lack of stability and security of work. So a related question that I would like to ask myself is, what does this mean in practice? Also, why is it important to focus on these key dimensions of labor market systems? Let me provide an example. Low quality of skills provided by the training and education system in the Western Balkans often does not adequately meet the requirements of employers, and therefore undermine growth and creation of jobs. Even if young people have appropriate skills, they may not be spotted by potential employers. There is often a lack of relevant, attractive, and adequate information to find job by young people. And then young people also, they lack affordable and quality career counseling and then coaching services. The problem can also be due to institutional barriers for private companies to invest and create jobs. So the two cases from RISI Albania and iKosovo touch one of the dimensions of labor market system, that's intermediation. Intermediation through the media in terms of providing attractive and relevant labor market information, and then also providing demand-driven job matching services. So these two projects, they also address other dimensions of labor market systems, which I just touched. As a case in point, the I project in Kosovo works in all three dimensions of labor market system that I've just described. The second key lesson that I would like to share is it's very important to also applying systemic approach, or known as market system development, to labor market system. It works, as we can see from the two cases presented here. The problem often is that development projects do things by themselves, and therefore they become part of the labor market system. I think for us, from our experience, we came to learn that projects in development need to be thought as temporary think tanks rather than, let's say, simple implementers, if the objective is to facilitate large-scale and durable impacts in youth employment. So to make this point more practical, I should mention that the two cases to be presented today demonstrate the need to design interventions in order to shift the behavior and practices of players. By doing so, the projects try to ensure that the expected changes in the different dimensions of labor market systems last beyond the lifespans of the project. This, in turn, in practice requires, as the experience of HELVETAS in the West Balkans demonstrates, that there needs to be a genuine commitment, not only just to understand the key principles of market system development, but also to apply them in different contexts and across different sectors such as IT and tourism. Some of the lessons can be adapted in other contexts such as in Africa, in Asia. So with that, I would like to stop and pass the mic to Gavin.
Hello. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Sorry about that. I had a slight problem with technology. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And the wonders of technology. I'm sitting in the northwest of Scotland, going to be talking about Albania to people all around the world, which is fantastic. Just to say, I'm actually an independent consultant. I haven't worked directly for RISI Albania, but I was asked to go in and review a very interesting project that they were doing with media. The reason for that is that I'm both a rural private sector development expert, M4P expert if you like, and also a media development expert, somebody who's been involved in doing media in different ways. This project's quite interesting for me to review because I was actually asked early on if I would help to advise it, and interestingly enough, I didn't, and I probably would have advised it to do it in a different way. But what we're seeing today is that actually they had a lot of success doing it without my advice, so they made me redundant, which is fantastic. So I'm going to take you through the case study. Amira from the project is also one of the participants, so I'm hoping that if there's any sort of technical questions or specific questions about that I'm not able to answer, Amira could also speak and be able to answer them for you. So why is this actually interesting? I've put 4 things down here. One is about sustainability. Obviously M4P tries to make different parts of the labour market sustainable. And actually few development projects have done this with mass media. You tend to find even with M4P projects, when they deal with mass media, they're often actually buying airtime or sponsoring airtime to try and maybe use media as a short-term catalyst to change something. What RISI Albania actually did in this context was actually to try and work with media to make it part of the labour system and to get them to change the way in which they covered labour issues, particularly for the young. Secondly, this is obviously applying media development to a new sector, youth employment, as you've heard. I've been involved in media activities that's looked in agriculture, in manufacturing, looking at private sector advocacy, for example, but this is the first time I'd looked at something in youth employment, which is also interesting. It was also it was a different approach from other approaches. As I mentioned, I probably wouldn't advise to do it in this way, and that makes it interesting for me. There was less technical inputs than I would have possibly recommended being provided, but actually it worked very well. There was a bidding process and a sponsoring airtime. We'll go a little bit into that. And I think there's some good lessons that come out of that. There are ways in which you can catalyse, I think in certain contexts, the media to change their ways without them becoming donor dependent. And the 4th thing is the impact. I'm somebody who believes very strongly that if we're going to do anything sustainable in media, we have to really understand the impact. And RISI Albania went into this feeling it was going to be very difficult to understand the impact of media, but actually working together with them, we managed to tie down a lot of very fascinating impacts from these programs and publications and online media they developed. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the RISI Albania project. It's not been running that long, established in 2013. It's basically a Swedish Agency for Development and Cooperation project, SDC project. Focused on youth unemployment, of course, trying to reduce youth unemployment, and implemented by HELVETAS, Swiss Intercooperation and Partners Albania. The project has 2 pillars. One is job creation through growth in specific sectors, and the second one is improved labour market information and intermediation services. So this is where mass media fits in. Mass media is about improved labour market information. It's about actually changing perceptions as well. I think media is often just seen as information. Actually, I think media provides a catalytic role, and as we'll see in some of the impacts, actually stimulating, for example, improvements in services in labour markets. And the project focuses on a variety: broadcast, TV, radio, print, newspapers, and online media. If you try and put that into a little bit of context, this project was focused very much on young people, but you also have to think about the influencers, the people who actually impact on young people when they are making their decisions. Obviously, family are one of those, other peers, older family friends. And of course, some of this media is more relevant to parts of this than others. Newspaper supplements, for example, maybe aren't so relevant to young people in this day and age, particularly in a country like Albania, but actually very, very influential on what I'm calling the influencers. TV programs influenced both. Radio programs, they also influenced both, primarily because the radio programs that this project worked with were actually youth radio programs. So they were very relevant to young people in particular. And online media, that's also of a lot of relevance to young people. So I think just one point is that if you're trying to get a media mix, working on the media to impact on young people, you have to also think about those people around them who influence their decisions and the way in which they go, the choices they make in education and in job seeking. So one of the things that was seen very early on in the project, when the baseline was done, the baseline almost came up with nothing. There was very, very little coverage on employment issues. Of course, there was a little bit. You would find in news, occasionally employment issues would come up. It's a big issue for government, but nothing in depth at all. The media was focused very strongly on politics and what was known as black news. That's the sort of more negative news, sort of things that happen in politics and accidents and the negative news. And why was that? Well, basically because employment wasn't really perceived as being attractive or profitable. In media, the attractiveness, the audience you can build up is very, very important to the profitability through advertising and bringing advertisement in. So people perceive this potentially as being boring, not that interesting, not something to invest in, and potentially not something to be that would be profitable. And if we look at Albania from an employment perspective, I was quite shocked, I suppose, by these figures. But having seen the figures that have been presented earlier, it seems like Albania is very similar to a lot of the world. 1 in 3 young people in Albania are unemployed, and you can see the gap between the older people and the younger, the 15 to 29-year-olds. Quite a significant gap. Women, even greater, 2% more. And this is fueling migration. Big issue for Europe, of course, big issue globally. And national priority, it is a national priority for governments. I think an increasing priority for governments. There's a lot of unrest, young people leaving the country. There's a lot of negative impacts on the economy. So the intervention approach, we split it into 7 different steps. 6 different steps. I noticed stage 6 is marked as stage 1. Apologies for that. Basically, the first step's easy. Initial media sector research and baseline data collected. And the second step was to raise awareness amongst the media about the potential for doing these sort of these kind of media. The project itself actually brought in international expertise. People from Germany were from very well-known broadcasters and publications came in to talk about what they did on employment issues, and actually showing that if you covered employment, you could actually generate revenues around this. For example, by advertising job opportunities, advertising training opportunities, and also more generally that it was something that was so important it would drive up audiences, readership. And that would help also to draw advertisers to your website or your publication or your broadcast. There was stage 3, where the people were asked to put in proposals. The media companies themselves were asked to put in proposals around specific terms of reference. Stage 4 was then choosing the media houses. 4 media houses were chosen in this first step, this first sequence, and they were then supported through a pilot season. I'll talk a little bit more about what that support was in a second. And then there was a second call for proposals, and a season 2 was supported. Now, the support that was provided, primarily technical support, co-investment, and audience monitoring and feedback. The technical support, was, as I think I said earlier on, quite relatively limited, I would say, compared with other projects I've worked on. Co-investment was obviously important. It was very tightly controlled. I think co-investment can be quite problematic if it's not very carefully done. You end up actually, just funding 100% because the other costs are kind of, poorly formulated and poorly assessed. But it was tight. It was, from my perspective, I saw it as being quite tightly controlled and proper co-investment. And the audience monitoring and feedback was really to help the media companies understand what the audience were thinking about these programs, get them feedback so they could drive up the quality of these programs. That also fed back into some of the technical support. As you can see from the diagram below that, what I think this is actually very important, is there was a very swift reduction in the amount of support that was provided. In the first season, there was 110,000 euros of support. Second season, 80,000, and then reducing to 0 in season 3. So really very little time for people to build any real dependence, and they knew that this money was going to be disappearing very fast. So this was really money to try and get them to try out a new idea and see if it was popular and effective. In terms of the media products that were developed, here's a sort of timeline showing you the different seasons. You'll see a number of different channels, media companies there. Top channel was the top-ranking TV channel in the country. They ran a program called Timun Desh. They had a season 1, a season 2. They're actually rebroadcasting season 1 again, and as I understand it, planning a season 3 as well. And that was an extremely popular program. The presenters were very enthusiastic about it. The newspaper obviously doesn't really have seasons. It ran all the way through and still runs at the moment. Club radio was a youth radio, and it has run 2 different seasons. Although the second season was very different from the first. The first season was more like programs. The second season was more like sort of short snippets. And A1 Report, another TV program, not quite as popular as the top channel, but also ran 2 seasons. Here's a graph showing some of the audience viewing and listenership. As you can see, this was a survey done by RISI Albania, but through an independent research company. And as you can see, a surprising number of listeners, a very, very high reach of these programs. The green relates to people who watched the TV program or read the newspaper, etc., at least 4 times. The red 5 to 10 times, the blue more than 10 times. So overall, the penetration of these publications was actually extremely high. These are some photographs showing Timun Desh there, the club radio, and one of the publications. What you can see in that diagram is that there were 6 products were actually supported with projects or launched with project support. 6 additional products emerged without project support, so there were 12 in total, which is a good, and I would say extremely fast example of replication happening very quickly. 2 online and 4 TV. TV seemed particularly the sort of the media that was strong in replication. in terms of impact on the audiences, obviously what media does is it changes people's perceptions, but then you also hope that they go on to change their behavior. There's obviously a lag between sometimes people's perceptions being changed and their behavior being changed. The research that we did actually showed that there was a surprising number of people who moved quite swiftly from changing their way that they thought about the employment, unemployment, job seeking, how to get training, and then going on to actually make a change in the way that they did that. And so you can see 71% of the audience changed their understanding and perceptions of employment. 32% of all the audience actually changed their behavior. So for example, that was 51,000 people for Team and Desh alone. And how did they change their behavior? What we saw by going out, meeting some of these people, tracking them down, meeting them, they changed the way in which they were training for employment, taking up new training in new areas, training for self-employment, taking up, actually getting involved in self-employment directly, even without training, starting a new business. We saw that happening. And I think what was driving all of those above that I've just talked about is that many people were beginning to sort of think, well, hold on a second, my perceptions about certain types of careers, maybe I'm wrong in it. Maybe I should be thinking about getting into my own career. Maybe actually getting involved in something more manual rather than trying to go to university might be a better way of doing things. Those are sort of changes that we saw happening. Another thing that wasn't anticipated by the project, but we saw some marked changes, was actually at service level change, where you actually had people who are involved, for example, in training, who listened to these programs and realized the services they were providing weren't perhaps adequate, and changing the way that they went about providing training. So, also not just impact on young people, but also impact at the service level. So there's a breakdown. As you can see, the influence in their choice in education and training was by far the largest of the impacts, followed by influence on how they look for a job, and thirdly, motivated them to start a business, about the same as the way they're looking for a job. So actually, impact on training was probably the biggest thing that we saw when we researched this. So what were some of the lessons that I would draw from this? As I said, I probably would have recommended this project to do things slightly differently, and it's very interesting how well it worked without that happening. One thing I would have said is, you need to actually have technical people working almost full time for you to be able to provide technical inputs, both from the project, but also having consultants, mentors, trainers to work with these products. The project didn't have that. In fact, it was fairly lowly. Had quite limited number of staff involved in this, and nevertheless, it worked very well. I think it could have worked maybe even better if they'd done a little bit more of that. But it's very interesting that actually it wasn't required as much as I would have anticipated it to have been needed. Marketing support. Marketing. There's some very good signs of sustainability. As we said, there's replication. There is advertising around these programs, but I think it maybe could have been even deepened if there'd been more marketing support. So that's maybe one of the things that I would have commented on. Use some possibly limitations of financial support, cost sharing. I think the project dealt with this very, very well, and it's one of the reasons for its success. But obviously there's also a danger there. And I think, for example, you might say that the choices that the youth radio station made around the way it launched might have been slightly different in season 1 if there hadn't have been the cost sharing element to it. As I mentioned, the importance of international expertise. Albania quite rightly perceives itself very strongly as a European country. So actually having people coming in from Germany, a respected media environments, influenced people very much, and they got very excited by that. So that's something that worked very well for the project. And impact monitoring and impact tracking. This was done retrospectively due to a belief that it would be difficult to measure the impact. But I think actually it is possible to measure. It's very possible to quantify. And actually the amounts of impacts that the project was tying down was surprisingly high. And I would encourage you to look at the full case study to explore those impacts in more detail. There's actually a lot of mini case studies within it that show the way in which this media has influenced people. So those last two comments I made at the bottom, just as a summary, experience from other projects is that if you pay for media space and airtime, then the resulting products, media products, are almost never sustained. And the projects supported by RISI Albania have strong signs of local ownership, investment and replication, and I would therefore say strong signs of sustainability. So, my recommendation to projects is think of doing similar things in this, of trying to work with the media in sustainable ways. The impact is high and the potential sustainability is high. And actually, as the RISI Albania shows, in certain media contexts, maybe the level of inputs and the costs involved aren't as high or as complex as many of us thought they might be. So with that, I'll hand back to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I think what we'll do is we'll go immediately to the next presentation. I'm seeing some of the questions are already coming in, but I suggest we have a more general discussion, and then maybe in your questions you can also say if you're addressing the question to somebody specific, that would help us to then distill kind of some of the questions. As we are more than 100, which is an amazing turnout, I'll hand over now to John, but please write down your question in the chat field in the lower right. So please, on the next, thanks Gavin, and on to you, John.
Thanks very much, Merten, and thank you, Gavin. It's interesting, actually, that a lot of the lessons that Gavin referred to at the end of his presentation there are similar to the ones that I've picked up on in terms of a very different type of program in job matching services. So please let me say hello to everyone and welcome to the final presentation of this webinar. As you all now know, I'm John Burns and I undertook the job matching services, or JMS, case study in Kosovo during the late part of 2015 and early 2016. Throughout the program of study, I worked closely with Albania Uraguchi. She was responsible for this intervention component, and I know that she's also linked into the webinar, and I encourage her participation and contribution later on. So specifically, I looked at the work that's been undertaken to improve the functionality of the market system for job matching services. And this was a component of the wider I program, which Zenebe introduced earlier, and that program started in late 2012. So very briefly, my presentation is going to look at some of the key aspects of intervention design and implementation, and then I'll dip into some of the results, and finally I'll look at some of the lessons which hopefully have a broader application for practitioners. So to kick off, the purpose of the intervention itself has been to align the supply of job matching services with the needs or the demand from both young job seekers and private employers. And the aim, therefore, is to contribute to greater opportunities in the labour market. Now, as some of you will know, Kosovo suffers from the lowest employment rates in Europe. And unemployment, as Merten referred to earlier on, is particularly high amongst the young, with all the associated socioeconomic implications there. And in Kosovo, a very large percentage of private sector employers are family businesses. There's a blossoming grey economy, and employers have tended to recruit in the past from within their own networks. The education system has tended towards the theoretical with no real alignment to the needs of the employers. And so there was an obvious mismatch between the two. And in essence, the core supply and demand market for job matching services looks something like this. So you can see on the supply side, we've got the job matching service providers and public employment services. And on the demand side, we've got the job seekers and the employers, with a weak and inefficient supply of services and a limited awareness and therefore low utility of those services. Now, once the design team had some insight into the JMS market in Kosovo, they looked at prioritizing the opportunities, and they did this through an analysis of the key drivers for systemic change. The vision was for JMS firms to be capable of operating on a durable commercial basis in a market where profit growth would drive momentum. The main constraint was identified as the small or thin market, which obviously inhibited that profit growth. And so to achieve the vision, an intervention was needed to develop the job matching services market through raising awareness and through the provision of new and value-added services. Now, as some of you will know, this is a pictorial representation of a theory of change. The design team at the time determined a hierarchy of objectives or a strategy, which indicated that if the intervention facilitated capacity and behavior changes of the market players in the JMS system through business planning and product development, then it was likely that there'd be a greater competition and product innovation, and that this would likely result in more job seekers engaging with the portals and more employers utilizing and paying for the services, and all of that thereby increasing youth employment opportunities. So coming on to implementation, what did the intervention area for JMS do? Well, in a nutshell, implementation involved an initial identification and selection of market players, and then a program, once those market players have been chosen, to facilitate and stimulate improvements in their performance. So in terms of identifying market players, the implementing team took some time to assess the capacities and incentives, or here shown as skill and will, of potential market players. And this helped to determine the focus of facilitation. From several candidates, the JMS intervention chose to work with two. They both had, the characteristics that they both had included a very positive attitude and a clear ambition to succeed. They both had a basic operational capacity, and they both needed to reach beyond their comfort zone, and they both needed some encouragement to reduce the incremental risks of change. In fact, in both cases, they were pretty much offering a single service at that point in time. Now, following partner selection, a program of support was designed which would be hopefully sufficient to stimulate that durable and profitable growth I referred to earlier. And this included business plan development and co-financing to mitigate the risks of introducing new services. And it's interesting here to note that the co-financing actually leveraged investment from both of the chosen partners that was threefold the initial investment. So they actually paid 3 times the initial co-financing investment into their business. Now, when I spent a bit of time talking to both, they told me that they would not have made that investment without the program support, and that that investment and the support gave them confidence to take that type of risk. And the investments were towards the platforms, the channels for the services to be delivered, and innovation around new products and services that met new market needs that were starting to arise. So, looking at results, again, many of you will probably recognize this matrix, which I think is quite a useful way, in fact, a very useful way of tracking systemic change. Essentially, the implementing team established a pilot phase and subsequently set up a crowding in phase. The pilot was there to stimulate partners so that they could experiment and demonstrate ownership of new business models, new service lines, and a product pricing structure, which they did. And as indicated earlier, the partners started investing substantially, given the context, their own funds in product development and service delivery platforms. Crowding in started to occur, and 7 new players entered the JMS market. Admittedly, many were copying basic services, and as you can see from this slide, employers started paying for services and new job seekers started engaging with portals and using other services. Now, interestingly, as these changes gained some traction, they were noted by others who were operating somewhere in the system, and they started to change in response. So, for example, the licensing of job matching service providers is being introduced, may well by now have been introduced, to reduce uncompetitive and unethical market behaviors. So there's a sense of creating some support to the marketplace. The Public Employment Service have actually revised their offer to ensure that they're not crowding out private providers. And interestingly, here in the early days, the Public Employment Service saw this part of the I programme to be in direct competition to what they did. And now the changes that have taken place have led to much more of a collaborative approach between the public and the private players. In addition, some regional players who are well established have started engaging the Kosovan JMS firms to undertake more cross-border and wider international work. So because of what has been observed in terms of changes in the market and the behavior of the firms, there's been a greater interest internationally, and investment has been made in bringing at least one of those 2 partners into a wider network, which covers 17 countries. Now, in terms of these results, I'm not going to take you through this slide in detail, so let's just look at 3 or 4 results. So from the baseline year of 2012 to the end of last year is a 4-year period, and over those 4 years, the number of registered job seekers has increased by nearly 3.5 times. The number of companies using and paying for services has increased by well over 3 times. The average gross income per market player has increased by just under 20 times. And the number of young women and men who found a job through a job matching service portal has grown from 0 in 2012 to over 15,700 in 2016. Now, the lessons learned, well, there are many, and I would equally encourage you to go to the case study document where there's a comprehensive list of lessons learned. But briefly today, what I'll try and do is highlight a few lessons that I think have wider relevance. Some of these I suspect will seem obvious to many of you, but in my experience, they're rarely considered, or if they are, they're rarely considered at the right time. And the focus that I'll take now is just to highlight mainly those lessons around the capture and utility of information and the strengthening of capacities. So we all know that rapidly changing systems tend to throw out a lot of new information. And during the course of my study, the study I undertook, I rapidly concluded that frequent systemic analysis, so regular systemic analysis, would certainly help to ensure that new information is captured and used. There are programs where an initial diagnostic is done of the market and then very little is done to re-look at that on a regular basis to see what sort of changes are taking place, which will allow a program to pivot some of what it's doing and use some of that information to inform the direction that the program takes. In addition, sort of monitoring processes tend to look at the performance of partners alone, but in order to enable us to get a better understanding of wider system behaviors, we need to look beyond those partners. And again, that information that we're receiving helps us to adapt the program accordingly and as a reaction to what we're picking up out there in the wider market. What I discovered as well was that the two market partners that were selected initially were a really rich source of information, and this information had significant potential to influence the evolving direction of the program. And accordingly, we really needed to use the partners as an information source to capture that information and use it to guide the program. What I also identified is that sometimes, understandably, there's a tendency for intervention managers to directly advise or even undertake work for and on behalf of partners. So there's a tendency, I'm not saying it happened here, I'm looking at a wider experience here, to, for example, write the business plan for a partner. And so I think it would help if projects which are particularly focused on the development of market systems would aim to embed this sort of facilitative approaches and behaviors and the tools around market systems development into a project team from the very outset. Then finally, sort of when considering an exit or phasing out, what this program did was in particular consider and test whether enough had been done to ensure that confidence in the strength of the system, wider system confidence in the strength of the job matching services system. And if that was the case, then the response should be to leave, to go. So I'd like just to thank you all, and I'll hand you all back to Merten now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Are you hearing me? Yes, looks like it's working. Thank you very much to all of you, Zenebe, Gavin, and John. Very interesting from my perspective. I wanted to start us off. Questions have already been pouring in. With one of the questions, so I'll go again through the same presenters. First a question to Zenebe, then to Gavin, and then to John. I'll try to summarize some of the questions that have been coming in through the chat box on the lower right. Let me start us off with a question that came in before the webinar started that was around lessons for replication. So if we look at these two programs, they seem to be quite successful in what they're doing. So to Zenebe, Zenebe, you said you had a few things to say on lessons for replications somewhere else. There was also a second question that you might want to answer on how did you choose the media to intervene in the case of Albania? And then I'll have more questions for Gavin, but he might also want to speak to that one. Over to you, Zenebe.
Thanks very much, Merten. To tackle the first question about replicability or adapting, some of the lessons, some of the achievements in other contexts. We know that the context in the Western Balkan is different from the context in other places such as Asia and Africa. The question is, how can the lessons from the Western Balkan be adapted and applied in other areas? There needs to be first of all some minimum requirements, which I call adaptive capabilities and enablers. Let me mention 3 of them. The first one is facilitation. In the 2 cases, in the 2 projects, we understood these to be creating the conditions for public and private market actors to drive change themselves. If we want to become effective facilitators, our experience tells us that we have to therefore avoid becoming actively involved in the market as market actors. Facilitators can provide support, even use subsidies as a way to build trust and joint visions and to contribute to the introduction and dissemination of new ideas. However, we must always be this always must be as part of an exit strategy. For example, the recent interventions in media relied to higher extent on technical inputs to the media as a key part of the offer, and then avoided financial cost sharing. This is one of the points. Second one is, in order to translate ideas using facilitation, which I mentioned above, a program should be ready to recruiting and building the kind of dynamic team that would enable to carry out an adaptive market development program. Again, an example from RISI, the intervention in the media also relied on recruiting, project staff with media and journalism experience. Of course, this is not the only criteria. One has to also consider soft skills of facilitators, the ability, for example, to convince others, to provide hands-on coaching, being innovative. The last point that I would like to mention as one of these minimum requirements is the importance of having right-sized and functional monitoring and result measurement system for the purpose of generating evidence to steer the program and learn from success, but also failures, which I call oops moments. This is very, very critical. Documenting experience will help, for example, for internal learning. It also helps for proving that the program is on course. In some countries which I saw, it's true that the most important knowledge is tacit. It's held in team members' head and not documented for internal learning and sharing others. So these are some of the key common minimum expectations that need to be in place for a successful adaptation, replication of some of the experiences from the Western Balkans. Back to you, Merten.
Thank you, Zenebe. I'll then follow on with Gavin. Gavin, I have kind of tried to summarize a few of the questions that you have already partly answered in the chat, but maybe not everybody has seen that. So I'd like to ask you 3 questions. There's a set of questions around sustainability and financing of these media programs. So what is the outlook into the future? Will these products continue, do you think? You said something about financing there already. Are you seeing other media programs taking up similar programs? So a bit kind of around financing and sustainability in the future is one question. Second question is around impact and attribution. How do you make sure that whatever you're measuring in terms of outreach of TV programs and then kind of more people getting information is attributable to the program? How do you monitor that? So that's the second range of questions. And then the final question, which is also a question for John, and I'll take that on again, is how inclusive is this? So there's a lot of questions around, is this actually accessible to the poorer youth? Are you monitoring that? How inclusive is this for women, for other groups in population? Over to you, Gavin.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, on sustainability, let me take the financing question first of all. The key thing about media is you have to attract an audience, and effectively then you have to attract advertisers, commercial sponsors, people who want to reach that audience, and that's what the project. Basically, what the sell of the project to the media partners was. It was to say to them, look, with these programs, we will work with you on them. We'll take away some of the risk, and we'll prove the popularity of these programs, and you should then be able to go out and market. In other contexts, in projects I've worked with the media, we've often got involved in supporting them to do that marketing. Whereas Albania didn't so much. A lot of the media houses they're working with are actually quite sophisticated, very commercial organizations already. And what I can say is that the audience has been proved, and advertising revenue has been generated around this. Is it a stage where it's the advertising revenue is covering all the costs? Not when we were looking at it, but the media is such that they perceive these things as being something that you invest in to drive up advertising, and all the signs were that the management and the people working on these programs saw these as being commercially very viable products to push into the future. And that's why you're seeing in answering the replication part of that question, you're actually seeing people already taking this up and actually adapting the idea into a number of different other potential media programs. What I would say about, in terms of replication, one thing I would say about Albania that struck me, most of my experience with media has actually been mostly in Africa and parts of Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And what I felt about when I met the media companies is how they were not very donor distorted in Albania. There hadn't been an awful lot of buying of media space. These companies seem very commercially minded, commercially oriented, and I think this is why the cost sharing seemed to work very well. I have a feeling that if you try to do something similar in some places where the media is much more distorted by the donors have a legacy of paying for airtime, it would have been a lot more difficult to do it as maybe as simply as Risi Albania did it, or as easily, and I think the money might have actually undermined sustainability, but in the context of Risi Albania it worked very well. Impact and attribution. How did we see that the impact was attributed? In fact, that was really the process that we went through. Is there were surveys undertaken, talking to people about the programs, whether they changed their behaviour, and then those that said they had changed their behaviour, they were investigated more to understand exactly how they had changed their behaviour, what choices they had made. So attribution was actually a key step in the whole process of trying to understand this. And that makes the impact monitoring slightly more costly, slightly more time consuming. But as we saw, we felt it was very worthwhile to really understand what these media products were doing. Are these programs, products inclusive? The research did look into inclusivity from a gender perspective and saw very similar usage and impact from a gender perspective, and I can't remember offhand how we handled the side of income, but I do know that accessibility was extremely high, and I don't have a sense that there was much there were many sort of cost problems of people engaging or getting access to these programs. Maybe Amira would just want to add a little bit more into that through the group chat on the inclusive side. She might be able to sort of talk a little bit more on that. So thanks very much. I'll hand back to Merten.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. Thanks a lot. So my next round of questions is for you, John. Again, maybe the question of inclusiveness that was addressed as the last one by Gavin. How do you make sure that these job matching services are inclusive of the right target groups, the ones that you actually want to reach? And then there were two other questions. One of kind of what were the main challenges in the job matching system? What didn't go well, or what did go well? And the last question on why would employers pay for these services? What are they actually buying, and how did it work that they started paying for these services? Over to you, John.
Okay, thanks, Merten. Taking the first of all the inclusiveness question. To a large extent, yes, quite a lot of work was built into the design of the program to ensure inclusivity, and the monitoring system in terms of gender at least disaggregated. Certain NGOs who were very specifically targeting women were drawn into the program and received various training interventions, and were involved in being mainstreamed into the program. I see a couple of questions coming through on the poor and from various places, and there's a question that's come through from Myanmar around I think the poorest, and I think this is a challenge. When I look back at what I discovered during the study, it was clear that the vast majority of the job seekers who were accessing and getting benefit from the job matching services were either school leavers or university leavers, and the majority were coming out of the tertiary system. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that it was crowding out the poorer, but I was saying that the poorer were probably in some way or form not in a position to access the systems. And as soon as the services, and as soon as we start talking about portals and platforms, then the assumption is that the users are reasonably IT competent and have the relevant smart technology to actually access. So there are some limitations there. In terms of a couple of questions have come up earlier around regional or rural versus urban. The tendency for this program has been where the employers are who are likely to be recruiting tend to be in the urban areas, and the job seekers who are coming out of those educational institutions I mentioned earlier tend to migrate towards the urban areas as well. So there was very clearly a focus driven by the market for the urban areas. But the program did do quite a lot to get out into the regions and start to talk to the regional vocational education and training schools. And in fact, the job matching service providers, the partners, were linked to those schools so that they could start talking about what the more regional or rural needs might be. So in terms of the replicability question, I think potentially yes, there are certain things that prerequisites for any program. Some of those I've already mentioned. One is the technology. So if you're using a platform to do this type of work, then there's a requirement for that technology to be in place. I can think of places where I've worked recently where there's potential to replicate something akin to the JMS component of the I program. And here I'm thinking in particular somewhere where culturally young people are used to using smart and mobile technologies for various things. So Kenya is a good example of that, given the take-up of mobile banking, for example. In terms of how do you get the employers to pay, yeah, that's a challenge, and I would be grateful for any thoughts from Valbona or Zenebe on this, but it took some time, and I think that eventually the message that the employers were starting to get through a sort of demonstration effect was that here we have access to a greater wealth of knowledge and skills, and we're starting to see that by using these mechanisms we could improve the growth and the profitability of our businesses, and therefore the use of those systems has a value to us. But obviously that didn't happen straight away, and there's still a lot of employers in Kosovo who wouldn't be willing to pay for those services. But the point is, from a virtual baseline of 0, there's several have started to see the benefit to them of using services and paying for those services. I hope I haven't missed anything out there. Please shout if I have, Merten.
John, maybe you can just say, what is it exactly that the employers are buying? So what are they paying, and what service are they getting for what they're paying?
Okay, I may have to refer, because I finished the work early in 2016. Then Zenebe may want to respond to this one as well. But essentially, they are paying for headhunting, wider search services, for pre-screening interviews, for quality, for accessing quality CVs for sort of managerial and higher level jobs. The amount they're paying, I think it differs, but it's certainly an amount that makes the provision of that service profitable. So I don't know if Zenebe would like to add to that, because obviously I haven't been fully immersed in this for nearly a year.
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah, so maybe just over to you, Zenebe, on this specific question, if you have anything to add on that, and maybe then this question that we, I think, forgot in the first round on why did you choose these media, and then either you or Gavin also on which one was deemed most effective, and why. Zenebe.
Okay, thanks very much, Merten. Just to add to what John said, I mean, due to the contribution, the facilitation of the project, we observed key behavioral change in the different actors. Just to give some examples, in the case of job matching service providers, the key behavioral change was the transition towards recruitment and then as a value adding human resource development services. From employers, the key change was willingness to pay for services, and then change in hiring behavior linked to greater awareness and request, demand for more sophisticated recruitment services. From job seekers' point of view, there is also behavioral change in terms of willingness to pay for services, and then also transferring soft skills to other job seekers using smart mobile applications to access job markets. The last kind of change that we observed was also in the public sector. Formal recognition of the role of the private sector in the provision of job matching services and other employment services was one of the critical changes. Just to move to the second question, which I forgot, sorry, to answer, why we chose the media sector. We used, as you may know, 3 key criteria. The first one is relevance of the sector to the target group, that's young people, young women and men, but also the opportunity that it offers in terms of increasing the the employability and then in turn employment of the target group. But also we also took into account the feasibility by the project in terms of making changes. Through analysis, we understood that in Albania, parents and families are the single most significant influencers of young people's career decisions. We know that. We also came to know that adequate and relevant information is crucial, for young people to make realistic education and career choices. We also looked at the interest of employers, to be able to find qualified and right workforce. And for the media also, I mean, it's huge potential in terms of making money out of that. We should remember that a fifth of the population of Albania are young people. Plus, we should also include the parents there. So these were some of the critical factors that we took into account in terms of choosing the media sector. Back to you, Merten.
Okay, thank you very much, Zenebe. There are a few questions again around the way to get these services sustainable. Maybe let me hand over again to you, John, on these questions. If somebody wanted to replicate this and the payment of employers, is it sustainable? Are these services now being sustainable? Is there anything that the program did to convince employers to pay, or was it all just the market that basically naturally emerged and employers came on?
Yeah, I think initially the program spent quite a lot of time working with, identifying employers and working with them so they could better understand or place a value on the services. But fairly quickly, there came to be an understanding of the value. Most employers who are private employers who are naturally businesses were able to understand the benefit to them of paying for a service. The pricing structure for that service was driven, since there was no initial market competition. The pricing for that service was more based on how to recover the costs of providing that service. But as you saw earlier from the slide on results, there are many, there are in the thousands of private employers now paying for those services. And that is now a market relationship truly. And I suspect that the facilitation, the communication, the awareness raising has been dropped because it is now understood as a valid supply of services to enhance a business's ability to grow.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, John. Maybe there was one question in the chat box that I could shortly address on why we're saying that youth employment and agriculture in many cases probably wasn't a good match. We've heard also from Bosnia that actually what you have is that youth are very often the first to migrate from rural to urban areas, and I think we can see that in many places all over. So if programs improve agriculture, very often what happens is that agriculture productivity is increased and not necessarily more manual labor is needed, but actually the operations are more capitalized in order to produce more, or there's new seeds that are more expensive, or there's support services that are bought more. So you can have an impact on income, and you can show that in many projects, but on youth employment it's very difficult because youth are the first to migrate. Agriculture is often not very attractive to them, and at the same time most programs, what they will try to achieve is a productivity increase in order to raise incomes, but not new jobs. And that's why I was saying it's really important to look at these urban markets, at job matching services through platforms, at media, because I think those are really the outreach channels to youth. Gavin, on your side, any more thoughts on how this will continue? Is there a longer term need for these types of programs, or do you think that basically replicate itself over time, and this will continue in terms of media programs coming up that address these information needs of youth and labor markets.
Yes. One of the opportunities I actually see for this project in terms of working with the media would actually be the way the project focused, and the programs and the media products that emerge tend to be quite informative in nature. But obviously, as these programs were discussing some of the issues, you could begin to see that they touched on policy issues, the way government is investing in training services, the way that services are delivered, a variety of different policy-related issues. And one thing I do think is that the media, yes, it's very relevant for information, but it's also very relevant for voice and to try and engage in the policy side. So I think there's lots of scope for this project also to sort of begin to expand the range of media products. Do I think this will sustain? Yes. I think there are going to be elements that inevitably will change. Some will disappear, but I think quite a lot will actually change into new forms, new focus. And the enthusiasm I saw amongst the media professionals and the managers of these media outlets was very, very strong. And they, from both a commercial perspective, but also from a perspective that they felt it was such an important issue, and almost like, well, why haven't we been covering it previously so much in the past? So I think in Albania it will sustain, and I think there will be clear signs of replication. It'll be really interesting to watch and see what actually happens, over the next few months and years. Maybe just one other thing I would just mention was the issue about replication. I think, what the experience of going in and reviewing RISI Albania did for me is to show very clearly that there actually, there certainly isn't a one-size-fits-all for intervening in the media market, and you really have to understand some of the dynamics behind it. I don't think some of the approaches that RISI Albania used would have worked, for example, in Nepal or in Uganda, where I've worked previously. I think they'd have to do a slightly different approach, but it just shows that you've got to adapt your intervention approach. But the underlying idea of trying to stimulate the media to create sustainable content around issues such as youth employment and agriculture and other sectors of business, whatever it is an extremely valid one, and it's as applicable in Albania as it is in countries like Nepal, Uganda, Indonesia. You just have to do it in slightly different ways.
Excellent, Gavin. Thank you very much. Also on addressing a bit kind of the replicability question, which is the last one I wanted to ask. So I think I'll leave it at that with you, Gavin. I think you also have to leave soon. Our participants numbers have already dropped by 30%. So I'm just going to ask you, Zenebe and John, to give us a few last words on what you feel as replicability and what is needed. I think Zenebe, you addressed that a bit already. What is replicable into other countries from these questions? Zenebe, over to you, then over to John, and then I'll close this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Merten. I think, I would repeat, what I said, and I also concur. I agree with what Gavin said. I mean, it's similar from the lessons that we learned in the case of Kosovo. But I would like to emphasize once again. I mean, the idea of facilitating. I think we can provide support, as I said, even subsidies in a way to build trust and joint visions. But the vision must always be as part of an exit strategy, and that's what we observed in the case of Kosovo. But also, I mean, the ability to monitor and document some of the key lessons for internal learning, but also to share these experiences so that they can contribute to additional innovative ideas is something which is common across across regions, across sectors. Yeah, with that, I would like to invite John, to add.
Thanks, Zenebe. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely endorse everything that you've just said. I think from the point of view specifically of job matching services, where are we now? 4 years on, many new players in a market providing, a significantly greater range of services to deeper and wider markets through the facilitation and stimulation of market development, and in the process created a greater propensity to pay. And if you take all of those things together, I can see no reason at all, again, as Gavin says, with adaptation to context, why where some of those prerequisites I referred to earlier, where they are in place, then this type of approach is not unique to a Kosovo or a Balkans-based country. It can be applied in many contexts, mainly I think in urban contexts. That would seem to be the most appropriate, as you say, Merten. There are challenges in the rural and context and in the agriculture value chains. But my view is that this approach is replicable, context dependent, provided those 2 or 3 prerequisites are in place. So, if we're talking about conflict-ridden and fragile economies, they have many, many other issues. But if we're talking about transitional economies or developing countries, then there are real opportunities here, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, John. This brings us to the end of this session, but before you go, please try to use the link that Sarah shared on, and she will share it again because I can't see it in the chat box anymore, on taking a small survey of this webinar. It helps really in terms of knowing what we did well, what we should do better in the future. I want to thank the presenters, Zenebe, Gavin, and John. Thank you very much for your work. I also want to thank the people behind this, so Sarah and Ashley Aarons and Lucio from the Beam Exchange, who have been very instrumental in organizing this. A last note on this again, that it's going to be on the Beam Exchange. You can see the recording of this session there. So just to go to the website after you have gone through the survey. And then thank you all for attending. It was we had really a big crowd, in times more than 100 people listening in. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the next webinar. Thanks.